ガンダム出るぞ。ビグバイ出る。弾空が発進する。マジンゴー。
Super robot shooting. Shooting with super robots. Although I have to take umbrage with this immediately, because if this is all about super robots, why is there a Gundam here? There's only ever been, to my knowledge, one super robot Gundam, and that's the Tryon 3. And that was a big deal because Gundam doesn't do super robots. Gundam was founded on the principle, no super robots. Because Yoshiyuki Tomino quite famously wanted to see what an actual military mech would be like. That's why Gundam doesn't have all these super abilities it pulls out of its ass at the last minute to have some sort of climax. Although very early on it did have combination sequences with the core fighter, but again, Gundam was not designed to be super robot. I mean, the original Gundam wasn't even designed to be colorful. That was a change made so it could sell toys to kids. And now it's all premium Bandai, and that's a rant I don't want to get into today, but probably inevitably will. And before we get into this, if you are photosensitive in any way like me, don't play this game. One of the midpoint stages is just really aggressive lightning flashing in the background, and a couple of your robot's super moves are epileptic nightmares. I'm not going to show any of that, so you're good, but yeah, if you are epileptic or photosensitive in any way, this is probably a game to skip. Super Robot Shooting is presumably an offshoot of the Super Robot Wars series. The best way I can describe this game is dollar store diet Star Fox. It's fairly rough around the edges, but it is good for maybe 1 or 2 sittings of gameplay. I mean, there's no save system, you have to beat it in one shot, and it's fairly short, but you know, you can have fun with it for a little bit, just don't pay too much for it. The story, near as I can tell, is there's like this weird space cyborg sphinx thing that looks like it's ripped straight off some kind of metal album cover. They're trying to hunt down some kind of like weird dragon thing that can approximate villains from various Super Robot series. So the Sphinx lady has to get all the heroes from those series to go fight them and then save the day, or something. There's not really a ton of plot until literally the ending of the game, when they decide to actually have some plot inserted, but it's not that interesting really. It's an arcadey rail shooter, but it's an arcadey rail shooter that makes me scratch my head a whole lot. Now in this game you have about half a dozen different characters, all representing different Super Robot series and Gundam. Now you might want to try all the different characters, I certainly did, and to be fair, that might be the best thing ever, or the most obnoxious thing ever, because you'll be hearing it every 2 seconds. Every character gets their own mission that's sort of based on their IP, although you can select whatever character you want for them. In this character selection screen, it's a little weird though, because next to the robot you're selecting, you might see a few portraits of other robots. I'm genuinely not sure what this is about. You might be saying, well, it's showing you the next ones you could cycle to select easily, but there are levels that actively remove this feature, and as far as I can tell, all these other robots that are listed next to the one you're selecting, I think they're supposed to show up in the stage or something. They do in the first stage, the Gundam theme stage, but then after that this feature seems to be dropped entirely. You might be suggesting, well, they launch with your character, so maybe they're part of your squadron, maybe you can swap to them. I've played with every single button on the controller. That does not appear to be a function in any capacity. In fact, this game seems to run with about 3 buttons. So I'm not really sure why this game is listing extra super robots and launching them with you, because they don't seem to actually involve themselves in anything, and there's 2 levels where you don't even have your wingmen who don't show up to begin with. It's a weird thing, and I don't quite understand it. But that pretty much sets the tone for the rest of the game. It's a fairly standard rail shooter. You select your super robot. What's interesting is, while these super robots are all supposed to be varied, they all play pretty much the same, with the exception of the guy that looks a bit like a bug and Shin Getter Robo, because those 2 don't have a lock-on attack. Now, as I discovered very late in the game, and by very late in the game I mean the final boss after being stuck on it for about 20 minutes, there are some slight differences with the robots in terms of their stats, and I only learned this because the new Gundam kept getting its face punched in by the final boss, and I swapped to one of the characters that didn't have a lock-on button to see if that would do any extra damage. Spoilers, it didn't, but they seemed to take slightly less damage and had more health, so I could just spam the basic attack and kill the final boss that way. That's about as much strategy as this game gets, I'm afraid. So yeah, the robots do have slight variations, but with the exception of 2 of them, they play basically identically, so it's basically down to pick the one you like the best. Your whole goal is to fly around shooting things that come at you from the background. This is a little bit weird though, because, and it's a worse problem with certain characters than others, but some of the characters are so big and the targeting reticle of them is so stuck to your character that your character can actually cover exactly what you're targeting, and it can actually be hard to tell exactly where you're aiming. This is a problem I have not seen since Iridian 3D on the Game Boy Advance. I haven't thought about that game in years. This is not good. This means that being able to actually aim and shoot at stuff is a bit of a problem. Each character has 3 main attacks. You have your standard weapon where you just shoot sort of directly in front of you. Good luck hitting anything with it. You have a lock-on feature that's slightly different for every character, but functionally it's basically identical. Some characters seem to take a lot longer to get their shots out, and some can only target a few enemies, whereas the new Gundam can target 4. And then they have a super move that seems to vary from character to character, but it's more or less a screen clearing bomb. I've basically just described 100% of the game to you in all of its nuance. There's not really much more going on here. This actually kind of came up while I was playing. I was wondering why I was doing this. Like, okay, I like games, so I'm playing this, but I mean specifically, why am I shooting enemies in this game? Because there's no reason to do it. Like, I feel like I shouldn't have to analyze a game incentivizing you to engage with its main mechanic, because that's supposed to be what you're doing in this game, but this game sort of lacks a reason to actually shoot enemies in a shooting game. Typically in these games, you have one of 3 key motivating factors, sometimes more. The first one being, okay, score. There's no score in this game, so that's out the window. Power-ups? There aren't any. There's not even health pickups, so hopefully you don't take too much damage, although this game is incredibly easy, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. So the final option is like survival, which, I mean, I guess that's as basic as we can go, but that's not even really functionally true in this game. Regardless of whether or not you're using your missiles or homing attack or whatever, if you're blind firing, again, you have to kind of contend with the fact that your character's in the way, which kind of reduces your combat options primarily to your homing attack. Unfortunately, you have to paint your targets with that, and especially with some characters, it's slower than others, so by the time you've done that and fired off your homing attack, assuming that the cooldown is fixed, because there is a cooldown for your homing attack, I guess they didn't want you to spam it, by the time you actually get these attacks off, in my experience, the enemy's already gotten their attack off, and they're leaving. So there's not really any survival element to actually shooting enemies in this game either, because the enemies have already effectively done everything offensively they can to you. The long and short of it is, this is a shooting game that makes me question why you bother shooting. And it's a shooting game that is primarily defined by not shooting and instead just turning it into a dodge game. Not shooting in this game seems about as purposeful and equally viable as actually taking enemies out in it. It's very weird. When you get outside of the standard bits of the stage, you'll run into the bosses, which I guess are like this weird cybernetic dragon's approximation of something from this series that, you know, you're fighting in this specific level, and pretty much all the bosses fight identically. They have increasingly large health pools, which makes the last 2 bosses of the game be obnoxious, and they'll try and flood the screen with little mook enemies so you can't get a lock-on, because lock-on attacks tend to do more damage than anything else, but that's sort of their strategy. Just try and kite your lock-on abilities and flood the screen with as many shots that have really ill-defined hitboxes so you can get hit even when you think you aren't getting hit, and that's sort of it. I suggest holding on to your super attacks to be used specifically for bosses, just so that you can take a decent chunk of their health bar down before any fight, because there's not really any nuance or strategy to using your super attacks. Like, in a lot of games you'd save your super attacks or your screen clearing bombs as like a fail-safe to get you out of a sticky situation, give you some invulnerability. That doesn't really work in this game. Instead, just puts you straight center of your screen, and the game stops. So you're not going to be able to just be exterior to the game itself for a few seconds to not take damage. And then when your super attack's done, suddenly your hitbox is back. So you're not exterior to any of this, and it won't save you from damage. You might as well just save your bombs for the bosses, and then just shoot the boss a whole lot, hoping that their minions don't steal your lock-on, and that's the beginning and ending of all the strategy in this game. The last 2 are probably the only source of difficulty in this game, which isn't to say that they're hard, they're just a little bit cheap. They really like to flood the screen with nonsense to the point where this basically becomes a bullet hell game, and you can't really tell where the hitboxes on half the bullets are. So that's sort of it. There's nothing else to talk about. It's a very straightforward, like I said, budget game. This is really just trying to make a cheap game on the quick, just to promote some series to hopefully get some extra money out of it. That's really all this feels like, is just diet dollar store Star Fox. And it's a shame because there are actually quite a few really interesting Japanese exclusive rail shooters for the PS1. I'm actually looking into a few right now, but this one is, well, I didn't pay much for this game, and it feels like a game I didn't pay very much for. Unless you're the biggest fan of Super Robots, you can probably skip this game because mechanically it is incredibly boring. Audio-wise, it's okay. I mean, they managed to get Amuro's voice actor to play Amuro, and I'm guessing all the other characters are played by their voice actors, so that's cool. The music itself, I think, is supposed to be indicative of all the series. I recognize the Mazinga theme in there, but the Gundam stage didn't seem to actually have Gundam music, or if it did, it picked the blandest stuff that I didn't recognize. And that really is my thoughts about all the music in this game. It's incredibly bland and dull, and what's more frustrating, none of it loops properly, and all the stages are longer than any one loop of the music, so you just have like 2 seconds of just silence before the song kicks in again. That's really bad presentation. And this is totally just a me problem. There's no way to cleanly record this audio. There's no sound test option. There's no options in this game at all. So we're just gonna have to use the game audio in the background here. Sorry if the music's a little choppy, but this game didn't really give me much of an option. Visually, the game looks okay. I mean, I recognize the stuff from the Gundam series, and it looks like how it should, so that's cool. Not really sure why the new Gundam is fighting Hyzax or Bound Docks, especially because there's only like 3 Bound Docks to my knowledge. But either way, that's kind of cool. And the Psycho Gundam? The new Gundam did not fight the Psycho Gundam. Heck, by the time the new Gundam came out, there was like a Psycho Gundam Mark III, wasn't there? The point is, there's Gundam things that, while they don't match the particular Gundam you're fighting, they look like Gundam things, and other things look kind of like what they need to. It's all very blocky and polygonal, but it's PlayStation. It looks good for what it is, and there's pre-rendered cutscenes that actually lovingly depict all of these things, and they look great. When you start a stage, you get like this really short cutscene showing off that specific robot that seems largely disconnected for what the game's actually trying to tell you, aside from this stage is going to be themed around this robot's enemies, I guess. It's kind of nice, and it does show that they put in the effort to actually make these characters look really, really good. Overall, the presentation is okay. The sounds in general are not all that spectacular, but visually it works well enough. Now, if you want a copy of Super Robot Shooting on the PlayStation, cheapest copy I see right now on eBay, shipping included, is about $35. I cannot recommend it at that price. This is a game I paid about $3 for, give or take, and it feels like a $3 game. It's not very long. It takes maybe about an hour to beat the game. I took about an hour and 10, and the last 20 minutes of it or so was just fighting the same final boss over and over again, but it's just not worth $35. It's a subpar rail shooter that doesn't seem to have any grasp of why you should actually shoot at anything, and seems to be purely skating by on its licenses alone, and it feels very weak in terms of gameplay. It's a functional game, and if you spend only a couple dollars on it, you could get an afternoon of fun out of it, I guess, but I wouldn't recommend you actively search out this game, and I wouldn't really say it's a must-have, especially at that price. If you want to shell out some extra money, for $100 you can get a limited edition version of this game that has a bunch of wind-up toys of all the robots. That's kind of cute, I guess. In fact, I'd probably have more fun with those wind-up toys than I had with this game, but Super Robot Shooting, it just feels like a game that's skating by on its license and is the definition of a minimum viable product. It's okay. It's kind of cute if you're fans of all the different series, but it's not all that spectacular, and it's far from a must-have import.
勇者よ、地球を見捨てるのですか？